to prevent getting an infectious disease and having to have you as my doctor is what? Wearing a mask?
No.
Telling you to do that? If somebody's, I can see they're ready to sneeze or cough, walk away.
You avoid all the paranoid aspects and do something positive. A, good diet. B, you don't smoke, I know. I know you don't drink, at least not very much, so that's pretty good. Get some exercise. I know that you don't get as much exercise as you should.
That's correct.
Get good sleep. I think that the normal, low-tech, healthy things are the best thing that you can do, David, is stay healthy.
All right, well, I'm going to try to do that, and hopefully when I next see you, I will be even healthier than I am today.
I would imagine you would be, and I look forward to that.
Thank you very much.
Don't wear a cloth mask. Cloth masks are little more than facial decorations. Don't wear a cloth mask. Cloth masks are little more than facial decorations.
But the idea, too, that natural immunity, because this is something that's become a bugaboo. Like, and you've said, like, dude, nature has a really good PR agent. Like, it just sounds cool. Like, natural just sounds better. And you could just say recovered immunity. More data coming out, still kind of saying, well, it's actually pretty good, right? If you've been
as you would expect. It's true for every other virus. I mean, with arguably the exception of flu. I mean, if you've gotten measles, there's no reason for you to get a measles vaccine or mumps or germ or rubella or chickenpox. I mean, you've been vaccinated essentially. But here, and I think it was probably more bureaucratic than anything else. It is not at all surprising that if you're naturally infected, that you will develop high frequencies of memory B and T cells, which should protect you against serious illness. And I think that is what the CDC now has shown. And I can tell you this, I don't think this was a confidential meeting. Hopefully it wasn't, but I was asked along with 3 other people to advise the administration on whether or not natural infection should count as a vaccine. I think that you just have to say, how are you going to show that you were naturally infected? So I think PCR would not be the way I would go. I would show that you have antibodies, say, to viral nuclear protein, just that, because that way you know that you've been naturally infected, because that's not something you would get from a vaccine. So you could do that, for example. So bureaucratically, that's tough. I understand that. But the 4 of us were asked to comment on, did we think natural infection basis should count in situations where the vaccine is mandated? And I was one of the 2 people that said yes. The other 2 people said no. But what was funny about that meeting, so it was Vivek Murthy, who's the U.S. Surgeon General.
He's a friend, yeah.
From CDC, and Francis Collins, who's still head of NIH, and Tony Fauci. So Vivek, who's a very sweet and kind man, started off saying, let's go around and just introduce ourselves first. So Francis Collins goes, Francis Collins, NIH. And, Rochelle goes, Rochelle Walensky, CDC. It's like, we're not asking you to introduce yourselves. We know who you are. It's like, I'm sorry, Tony, what was that last name again? I didn't catch that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I listened to my colleague's speech. I had a constituent that wanted me to ask a question about outside interference to our democracy. Klaus Schwab is the head of the World Economic Forum, and he bragged how his subversive WEF, World Economic Forum, has, quoted, infiltrated governments around the world. He said that his organization had penetrated more than half of Canada's cabinet. And I was wondering, in the interest of transparency, could the member please name which cabinet ministers are on board with the WEF's agenda? My concern is the deputy.
Order. I know that the member was in a really good question there, but the audio is really bad and the video is really bad as well. And I apologize. I don't know if the member. Okay, let's try again. The honorable member for Timmins James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, that member was promoting open disinformation. That's not debate. We have to call out disinformation.
We'll get into debate again.
I really believe COVID has created a window of political opportunity and maybe an epiphany.
If you're saying that the necessity for vaccine mandates in workplaces is gone on March 1st, should people that were fired, that lost their employment because they refused to get a vaccination, should they be rehired?
Well, I would leave that up to the individual corporation. Our policy and recommendation was to have an immunization policy, whether you vaccinate or get tested. If they've gone forward and had a mandate, which was not our direction, I would leave it up to the individual corporation to negotiate that with their workforce.
So one of the questions that I've heard from a number of people is, doing the safety trials obviously is incredibly important because you want to make sure that you're not injecting people with something that could be harmful. But once you have that, why not push harder on rolling it out more aggressively, even if you don't know exactly how effective it is? What's the public health rationale and thinking behind needing to prove that it's extremely effective before rolling out something that you know is safe?
Okay, that's a good question. The initial safety study, Mark, is to see if I inject it in the arm, does it have some sort of idiosyncratic or bad reaction? There's another element to safety, and that is if you vaccinate someone and they make an antibody response and then they get exposed and infected, does the response that you induce actually enhance the infection and make it worse? And the only way you'll know that is if you do an extended study, not in a normal volunteer who has no risk of infection, but in people who are out there in a risk situation. This would not be the first time, if it happened, that a vaccine that looked good in initial safety actually made people worse. There was the history of the respiratory syncytial virus vaccine in children, which paradoxically made the children worse. One of the HIV vaccines that we tested several years ago actually made individuals more likely to get infected. So you can't just go out there and give it unless you feel that in the field, when someone is getting infected and exposed, being vaccinated doesn't make them worse.
Good Morning America is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer. Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This weather report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press Data Download brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
We're really taking that leap, us as a company, Bayer, in cell and gene therapy, which to me is one of these examples where really we're going to make a difference, hopefully, moving forward. There's some, ultimately, the mRNA vaccines are an example for that cell and gene therapy. I always like to say, if we had surveyed 2 years ago in the public, would you be willing to take gene or cell therapy and inject it into your body, we would have probably had a 95% refusal rate. I think this pandemic has also opened many people's eyes to innovation in the way that was maybe not possible before.
Could we have improved? Well, you know, I think I can tell you where I was when the CNN feed came that it was 95% effective, the vaccine. So many of us wanted to be hopeful. So many of us wanted to say, okay, this is our ticket out, right? Now we're done. So I think we had perhaps too little caution and too much optimism for some good things that came our way. I really do. I think all of us wanted this to be done. Nobody said waning when you know, oh, this vaccine's going to work. Oh, well, maybe it'll work, it'll wear off. Nobody said, well, what if the next variant doesn't, it's not as potent against the next variant.
And we've come to a moment that, quite frankly, we've seen coming over the past years. And we've talked about it in the news, not just about Ukraine, but about democracies around the world, that we see a bit of a slippage in our democracies. Countries turning towards slightly more authoritarian leaders. Countries allowing increasing misinformation and disinformation to be shared on social media, turning people against the values and the principles of democracies that are so strong. And that slippage over the years, unfortunately, emboldened Putin. and made him think that he could get away with this, that he could get away with it in Ukraine.
Even with Sun TV watching for any slip, he was asked which country he most admired and referred to China.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start, investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about, of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted, that I find quite interesting.
Well, I only have a minute left. Let me ask you, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've uncovered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country, and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100% it would be the Russians that would be behind it?
There is no doubt in my mind, Senator, and it is classic Russian technique to blame on the other guy what they're planning to do themselves.
I want to get a little into the weeds here and the mRNA technology. When you and your colleagues were trying to decide which route to go down, the traditional vaccine route or the mRNA route, you write that it was, quote, most counterintuitive to go the mRNA route, and yet you went that route. Explain why.
It was counterintuitive because Pfizer was mastering, or let's say we had very good experience and expertise with multiple technologies that could give a vaccine. Adenoviruses, that some of the other vaccines are. We were very good in doing that. Protein vaccines, we were very good in doing that, and plus many other technologies. mRNA was the technology that we had less experience, only 2 years working on this. And actually, mRNA was a technology that never delivered a single product until that day. Not vaccine, not any other medicine. So it was very counterintuitive, and I was surprised when they suggested to me that this is the way to go. And I questioned it, and I asked them to justify, how can you say something like that? But they came and they were very, very convinced that this is the right way to go.
The good news is the elite across the world trust each other more and more. So we can come together and design and do beautiful things together. The bad news is that in every single country they were polling, the majority of people trusted that elite less. So we can lead, but if people aren't following, we're not going to get to where we want to go.
Prime Minister, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends. As you know, the theme of this annual meeting is Mastering the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I couldn't imagine anybody who could represent more the world which will come out of this fourth industrial revolution. It certainly will be a world, hopefully, not certainly, hopefully, if we take the right decisions, which will be a diverse world characterized by plurality. It will be a world which will combine significant investments into the future, into our soft and hard infrastructure, with fostering entrepreneurial activity, at the same time social responsibility. It will be a young world. It will be a digital world. Now, who could represent such a world better than you, Prime Minister. We are very glad that at the beginning of this meeting, you are talking to us to represent also a new, open Canada. I want to use this opportunity also to thank our Canadian constituency, which always has been a very loyal and very much engaged constituency here at the Forum. But now, I think with you, together with our constituents, Prime Minister, we can make sure that in the future we strengthen the cooperation even more with your country. Prime Minister, we are very much looking forward to listen to you, and actually the discussion will be moderated by my friend Farid. So we will have some exciting, interesting moments. Thank you.
And I have to say, when I mention now names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more, half of this cabinet, are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
And that's true in Argentina too. Wow.
But she's had the flu for 14 days. Should she get a flu shot?
Well, no. If she got the flu for 14 days, she's as protected as anybody can be, because the best vaccination is to get infected yourself.
Our data from the CDC today suggests, that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick, and that it's not just in the clinical trials, but it's also in real-world data.
Right. But getting that shot really was an amazing feeling. It hits you.
Hello, I'm Peter Doshi. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and hopefully you can see my title slide with the financial disclosures. For identification purposes, I'm on the faculty at the University of Maryland and an editor at the BMJ. I have no relevant conflicts of interest, and my comments today are my own. Next slide, please. Last November, the BMJ reported the disclosures of a whistleblower named Brooke Jackson, who worked for Ventavia, a contract research company that ran 3 of the clinical trial sites for Pfizer's vaccine. Jackson alleged that the company had falsified data, unblinded patients, employed inadequately trained vaccinators, and was slow to follow up on adverse events. She provided the BMJ with company emails, internal documents, text messages, photos, and recordings of her conversation with company employees. Next slide. This photo, for example, shows vaccine packaging materials that are only supposed to be seen by unblinded staff, just left out in the open. Next slide. And unblinding may have occurred on a far wider scale. Here you can see the document containing the instructions Ventavia staff were given to file each trial participant's randomization and drug assignment confirmation sheet into each participant's chart. This contained unblinded information. Next slide. Unblinding, as I think everybody knows, creates serious concerns about data integrity. Once this massive error was discovered, Ventavia asked staff to go through each and every chart to take out the randomization and drug assignment confirmation. You can see here an email from Ventavia's COO reacting after discovery of the problem. They had not even realized that the drug assignment confirmation contained unblinding information. Next slide. In the heat of a pandemic, it's not hard to imagine that corners were cut and mistakes were made. Some mistakes are benign, but others carry serious consequences to data integrity. One hopes Ventavia is an extreme outlier, but we need more than just hope. We need evidence that the data were dealt with properly. We need regulatory oversight. But despite whistleblower Brooke Jackson's direct complaint to the FDA never inspected Ventavia. In fact, FDA only inspected 9 of the trial's 150-plus sites before approving the vaccine. Just 9 sites. And Pfizer continues to use Ventavia for trials. Next slide. What about Moderna? FDA had over a year and inspected just one of the trial's 99 sites. How can FDA feel confident in the Moderna data based on a 1% sample? Next slide. Data integrity requires adequate regulatory oversight. Trustworthy science requires data transparency. It's been over a year, but anonymized participant-level data remain inaccessible to doctors, researchers, and the public. The public paid for these products, and the public takes on the balance of benefits and harms post-vaccination. The public has a right to data transparency, and FDA has an obligation to act. Thank you very much.
Dr. Fauci, we don't know whether the pandemic started in a lab in Wuhan or evolved naturally, but we should want to know. 3 million people have died from this pandemic, and that should cause us to explore all possibilities. Instead, government authorities, self-interested in continuing gain-of-function research, say there's nothing to see here. Gain-of-function research, as you know, is juicing up naturally occurring animal viruses to infect humans. To arrive at the truth, the U.S. government should admit that the Wuhan Virology Institute was experimenting to enhance the coronavirus's ability to infect humans. Juicing up superviruses is not new. Scientists in the U.S. have long known how to mutate animal viruses to infect humans. For years, Dr. Ralph Barrick, a virologist in the U.S., has been collaborating with Dr. Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan Virology Institute, sharing his discoveries about how to create superviruses. This gain-of-function research has been funded by the NIH. The collaboration between the U.S. and the Wuhan Virology Institute continues. Doctors Barrick and Shi worked together to insert bat virus spike protein into the backbone of the deadly SARS virus, and then use this man-made supervirus to infect human airway cells. Think about that for a moment. The SARS virus had a 15% mortality. We're fighting a pandemic that has about a 1% mortality. Can you imagine if a SARS virus that's been juiced up and had viral proteins added to it, to the spike protein, if that were released accidentally? Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Do they fund Dr. Barrick?
We do not fund.
Do you fund Dr. Barrick's gain-of-function research?
Dr. Barrett does not doing gain-of-function research, and if it is, it's according to the guidelines, and it is being conducted in North Carolina, not
You don't think inserting
in China.
a bat virus spike protein that he got from the Wuhan Institute into the SARS virus is gain-of-function?
That is
You would
not
be in the minority because at least 200 scientists have signed a statement from the Cambridge Working Group saying that it is gain-of-function.
It's my privilege to have been asked to conduct our service today to celebrate the life of Alan Wright. I therefore offer you all a very warm welcome as we unite in love and friendship to
Church joins us now live, and Logan, this one takes a bit of explaining. What are the details?
Well, Simon, today the Ministry of Health added another death to its COVID-19 recording, but also said it was a case subject to a police investigation that's ongoing. Now, One News understands that this is in relation to Operation Metals, a homicide investigation launched after a man named Robert Hart sustained serious gunshot injuries outside a Newland motel last week, and he died despite first aid attempts. Now, since his death, health authorities say he tested positive for COVID-19, and One News understands that several people are also isolating. So then you have to ask how someone who sustained these types of injuries and then died ends up as part of our COVID-19 death tally. Now, the Ministry of Health says that's because under the World Health Organization guidelines, anyone who dies while also having an acute COVID-19 infection is recorded as part of a nation's death tally, whatever the cause of death might be. Now, exactly how this man died will be subject to an ongoing police investigation as well as an investigation by the coroner. And meanwhile, 3 people have been charged in relation to the death, and police are still hunting for a 4th.
And yet, despite the fact that we've now essentially clinically tested the vaccine on billions of people worldwide, around 1 in 5 Americans is still willing to put themselves at risk and put their families at risk rather than get vaccinated.
You're going to be able to get your vaccine as soon as you turn 5. And I know you're excited and I know you're eager. In some places across the country, you can even start making your appointment now for shortly after your birthday.
Information laundering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet. So disinformation's origins are slightly less atrocious.
Insects are becoming a trend. The Western diet has to kind of shift and change. And most importantly, it's natural, it's normal, and it's the way that we have to feed the future.
Frankly, there were allegations of extramarital affairs, and when she was asked about that in the interview, she said that is a question that Bill needs to answer. So here you are now. Did that happen? Were you unfaithful in your marriage? Is that one of the reasons there was a divorce?
I certainly made mistakes, and I take responsibility. I don't think delving into the particulars at this point is constructive, but yes, I caused pain, and I feel terrible about that.
What have you learned from that? I mean, you were someone who has this voracious appetite for knowledge, and divorce is an experience that can be a journey into learning something about yourself and change, hopefully. What have you learned about yourself?
There's areas like climate or, health where I have expertise, and on personal matters like this, I don't think of myself as an expert. I should be very humble about, success, has a tricky aspect to it. So, I don't have great advice for other people.
Yeah.
Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the problem.
Ensure,
we can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media? I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
Frankly, if you're not vaccinated at the moment and you're eligible and you've got no health reason for not being vaccinated, you're not just irresponsible. I mean, you're an idiot. I'm sorry. I mean, that is, truthfully, you are. I mean, because this Omicron variant is so contagious. If you're unvaccinated and you're in circulation, you're going to get it.
And I agree with what Chairman Powell said last week, that the number one threat is the strength and that strength that we built is inflation. So the Fed should.
Many scientists are beginning to believe that a vaccine against AIDS may be impossible to make and too dangerous to test.
If you take it and then a year goes by and everybody's fine, then you say, okay, that's good. Now let's give it to 500 people. And then a year goes by and everything's fine. You say, well, then now let's give it to thousands of people. And then you find out that it takes 12 years for all hell to break loose. And then what have you done?
Your COVID-19 vaccine, you're going to want to listen to this. The Red Cross says anyone who has received their COVID-19 vaccine cannot donate convalescent plasma to help other COVID-19 patients in hospitals. That plasma is made up of antibodies from people who have recovered from the virus, but the vaccine wipes out those antibodies, making the convalescent plasma ineffective in treating other COVID-19 patients.
If you look at a cross-section of a human hair, I've got a plot on the bottom of page 7. You see that dot. That dot is 10 times the size of a virus. It's a micron or so. So the COVID particle is 1,000 times smaller than the cross-section of human hair. And I ask everybody the simple question. You wear your mask, can you slip a human hair by the side of your mask? Of course you can, especially below the eyes. It's a super freeway for the virus to come and go. This source control argument is bogus. Source control means the person wearing the mask somehow or other, those viruses can't escape the mask.
So you had had two vaccinations and then 2 booster shots. Is that right?
That's right. And for people over 50 or 60, they'll probably have to be boosted every 6 months until we get even better vaccines.
So I've been trying to figure this out for myself. I assume you know the answer to this, so I'll just ask you. When do you get boosted again? I mean, now that you've had it, I've had it around the same time. I've only gotten 3 shots total, only been boosted once. I guess we have immunity for a little while, but when do you decide to get boosted again?
So an infection where you'll get a high viral load would be like vaccination. But, to be safe, every 6 months, you're probably going to be vaccinated. As we get more data, they might even make that shorter for people who are, say 60 or over 70, where the duration seems to be a bit lower. So we're in for ongoing vaccination to stay absolutely safe.
The pandemic has been the ultimate disruptor. It has changed our realities and given us cause to pause and reflect. In the disruption is an opportunity for us to reset.
And over the next 3 years, there is much work to do. We will build back better from the COVID crisis. Better, stronger, with an answer to the many challenges New Zealand already faced. This is our opportunity.
Fortunately for us, we already have a blueprint for such a world in the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda.
We've incorporated the principles of the 2030 Agenda into our domestic policy making in a way that we hope will drive system-level actions. This is not just a new scorecard. It is about fundamentally changing how we make decisions and therefore how we allocate resources.
You think the board was mischaracterized, then the disinformation board is being shut down because of disinformation? Is that what's happening here?
Look, I mean, the board was put forth for a purpose, right? To make sure that we really did address what was happening across the country when it came to disinformation.
And it's okay to wait now 75 days.
It's just it's going to pause. There's been a mischaracterizations from outside forces, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to pause it and we're going to do an assessment. But the work doesn't stop. We're still going to continue the work. The DHS is still going to continue the work.
Okay.
One final question. Did the Ottawa Police make a request to the federal government to invoke the Emergencies Measures Act, yes or no?
So we were involved in conversations with our partners and with the political ministries. We didn't make a direct request for the Emergencies Act.
Thank you for that fruitful exchange.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75.
It is basically biological chip that it is in the tablet, and once you take the tablet and dissolves into your stomach, sends a signal that you took the tablet. So imagine the applications of that, compliance. The insurance companies to know that the medicines that patients should take, they do take them. It is fascinating what happens in this field.
So we, we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is will get attention this time.
And we also know that the vast majority of Canadians believe in having some way to prove that vaccination, having a vaccine passport. And we know that people on the front line that are providing care or providing services directly to Canadians can pose the higher risk and should be vaccinated. So we would work with unions and work with the workers on the ground to make sure we establish a way to move forward, but we absolutely believe that there needs to be mandatory vaccines, and there would be consequences for those who are not able to or not willing to do that, and we could look at what those consequences are. We absolutely believe that there needs to be mandatory vaccines, and there would be consequences for those who are not able to or not willing to do that.
Let's also be clear. The future is not just happening. The future is built by us, by a powerful community as you here in this room. We have the means to improve the states of the world. But two conditions are necessary. The first one is that we act all as stakeholders of larger communities, that we serve not our only self-interests, but we serve the community. That's what we call stakeholder responsibility. And second, that we collaborate. And this is the reason why you find many opportunities here during the meeting to engage into very action and impact-oriented initiatives to make progress related to specific issues on the global agenda.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker. Stay tuned. We don't have it operational yet, but this is something that we're working on.
There's two kinds of dangers. One is what I just talked about, that we've arranged a society based on science and technology in which nobody understands anything about science and technology. And this combustible mixture of ignorance and power, sooner or later, is going to blow up in our faces. I mean, who is running the science and technology in a democracy if the people don't know anything about it? And the second reason that I'm worried about this is that science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along. It's a thing that Jefferson laid great stress on. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
What does the research tell us now about the risk for air passengers contracting COVID-19 on commercial flights?
Yeah, so there's been very few reports, extremely rare reports actually, of transmission aboard aircrafts. And I think we are learning more and more about some of the technologies, if you like, in terms of the ventilation and the way that aircraft ventilations work is actually, the modern aircraft is actually really good in terms of air exchanges and the way that the airflow occurs in the cabin. So there has been a few reports, but actually very, very little. I think we continue to ask provinces to report to us if you've seen reports to actual positive passengers, but have not demonstrated an actual transmission on board the aircraft itself. We have not received that kind of report. But the other thing is that in that setting, there are ways in which you could put in procedures like mask wearing. People are sitting facing the same direction with seat backs, in front of them. So there are a number of reasons, perhaps, as to why we are actually not seeing the actual conveyance itself as being a main area or setting of spread.
Did yourself or anyone in the OPS request the invocation of the Emergency Act?
I did not make that request. I'm not aware of anybody else in the Ottawa Police Service who did.
In changing a death certificate, and why was that being asked of you? And so it's something that should never happen.
No, and as a physician in the hospital, where if patients under my care, I'm considered the most responsible physician, or the MRP, and so I was the MRP for this patient who is actively dying, and she passed away in the morning, and I was called to fill out the death certificate, which I did. And then about 5 hours later, I was contacted by a nurse saying that this patient tested positive for COVID. I had to come back and change the death certificate. And so I said, no, I don't. She passed away of natural causes, and I won't say what those were, but I was highly confident. I knew all of the details of her chart. To the best of my ability at that time. I knew she'd been tested 2 days prior as well and was negative. And she was actively dying. She was hours from the end of her life, and she passed before that was resulted. There was no, there's another ethical issue there in violating someone's body with no permission while they're dying. There's no dignity there. So anyhow, I said, no, I'm confident that this is what it is. That didn't contribute whatsoever to her death. And then it just didn't end there. It went on.
So another desire was for you to say that the cause of death was COVID, not that she died having tested positive for COVID.
Yeah, to change the death certificate as if COVID should have been added. But she didn't have COVID. There's so many issues that we could go into and branch into that are about, reliability of testing and things like that. But regardless, her body was almost expired anyway by that time. Why would you test her? No one was in that room. Her family wasn't allowed to come in. Nobody had been exposed. It was just really unreasonable and absurd.
Canada is one of the only places left in the world that requires vaccinations. In Europe, most countries have dropped all mandates. You don't need one to fly in the United States. In fact, in the U.S., unvaccinated people can fly maskless on planes. Why do you think the Prime Minister is continuing to hold down, continuing to extend the restrictions as he did this week?
I would really love you all to ask him that question over and over and over again and put it in your papers and whatnot. Why do I think? Well, there's clearly an alternative agenda because it's not about COVID. I don't think it's about COVID.
In effect, when you think of censorship, what else is happening is, and this is a big thing in academia, is I consider now there's a problem with self-censorship. So what happens when this occurs, and if it doesn't happen to you, but if it does, you suddenly have to withdraw a bit and go, well, what can I publish? What can't I publish? And the people around you go, well, I ain't going there. I'm not going to retweet this article. I'm not putting it out there because I fear for my job. If I am seen by somebody as being on the side of something that's not the status quo, maybe I won't get that promotion.
So you'll be the last question, but I just want to weigh in on that for 1 second. So there's another word for master narratives. It's called history. Basically, every country creates their own narrative story. And my old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. We haven't talked about propaganda. Propaganda, I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population. And I don't necessarily think it's that awful. And this idea of a news cartel, I mean, I was editor of Time in 2012 during that election, and I remember, you're competing against cartels and everybody. I remember being on a panel with the then editor of the New York Times who said, it's really hard to break through these days. This is the editor of the New York Times saying it's hard to break through. I wanted to jump off the platform. Like, what's it like for the rest of everybody? So, I mean, there are cartels, but cartels don't have hegemony like they used to. The gentleman right there, last question.
I don't think you want to address an issue in terms of understanding what happened in the world. Because what is happening in America is what the United States flipped on the global south and in the third world, which we live with for many, many years in terms of a master narrative that was and still is propaganda.
You know what? I hate last questions. Don't you? I usually just want to end something before the last question. But at any rate, I want to thank this fantastic panel here today. And I do want to say, I actually think, the talk about optimism, the optimism is all of you there figuring out how to teach your students about this and using some of the techniques and some of the sources that we've talked about here today. And I hope you're successful. Thank you very much.
When you're getting elected as a progressive, you're reaching out to thoughtful people who have a lot of things going in their life, who don't live and die by politics, who aren't going out there marching in the streets, although, sometimes when you have to get rid of a particular right wing, you need to. But mostly, these are people who are focused on their families, on their jobs, on their career, on the idea of fighting climate change. But
yes, the social contract is broken.
Yeah.
They've taken advantage of good people. The social contract, as described by whatever Hobbes and the rest, that we keep our noses clean, we behave and do our bit, and in return, the state will protect our freedoms, keep us safe from harm. That contract has been broken.
Not only broken, shattered, in my view.
And I think part of the solution lies with people stepping away from the social contract, because it's not us that broke it. We weren't the unfaithful partner in the relationship. We have been cheated upon, and the solemn vows taken have been broken, but not by us. And it's no longer, I think, incumbent upon us to live by the social contract, up to and including paying tax and all of the rest of those things. We're in a situation now where I think people quite rightly should feel entitled to come together in different communities, come together in different ways, be they people who are in physical proximity to one another, or people who are joined together by the wonders of the internet, because that is a double-edged sword that gives as well as takes away. And I think people have to find new ways to relate to one another and to ignore the state, because the state has let us down, because it doesn't have our interests at heart.
It wasn't until early February, when I was in a meeting, that experts at the foundation said, there's no way, there's been too much travel without diagnosis for us to contain this. And then at that point, we didn't really understand the fatality rate. We didn't understand that it's a fairly low fatality rate and that it's a disease mainly of the elderly, kind of like flu is, although a bit different than that. So that was a pretty scary period, right, where the world didn't go on alert, including the United States, nearly as fast as it needed to.
And the title of this session, are we ready for a new world order?
Building Back Better means getting support to the most vulnerable while maintaining our momentum on reaching the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs. Canada is here to listen and to help. This pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset. This is our chance to accelerate our pre-pandemic efforts to reimagine economic systems that actually address global challenges like extreme poverty, inequality, and climate change.
It's a very pertinent question to ask, how do we build back better?
To build back better or whatever.
We have a chance to reset the clock and build back better than before.
To build back better than before.
Remember the terrible damage of COVID as we try to build back from this global pandemic.
Joe Biden calls it Build Back Better.
Build back better.
Building back better.
To do things differently. To build back better.
We're going to build it back better.
And build it back better.
My plan to build back better.
Start taking all the problems that have been created in education and mental health and start to build back in a positive way.
I have launched a booklet called Build Back Better, Britain After Coronavirus.
It's about building this country back better.
Growing conspiracy following it. It is called the Great Reset.
An unprecedented opportunity to rethink and reset the ways in which we live.
The great opportunity for reset.
The theory even calls Mr. Biden's campaign slogan, Build Back Better, a front for the conspiracy.
Build back better.
Building back better our economy.
Build back better.
All elements of the Great Reset are fundamental to building the future we need.
This pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset.
It's a big effort to, some would say, to build back better. We would say to really have a great reset.
Conspiracy, conspiracy.
Conspiracy. I wondered whether you felt there had been a communication error from government officials throughout this pandemic by suggesting initially that the primary reason to get vaccinated was to prevent you getting COVID at all, as opposed to reducing the severity if you do or when you do catch it, and whether we're now in rather an awkward position, given that earlier comms, that so many people are catching COVID, whether they've been, if they have already received a vaccine, even if they've received the booster. It kind of puts quite an awkward spin on things now.
Well, I think it was the question of what people interpreted. If you looked at the clinical trial, the tens of thousands of people in the original clinical trials, for example, with Moderna and Pfizer, the primary endpoint that led to the 94 and 95% efficacy in those trials was prevention of symptomatic disease, not prevention of infection. So although you're absolutely correct, there was a lot of people understandably felt that I'm not going to get infected at all. The primary reason is to prevent you from getting symptomatic disease, but importantly, to prevent you from getting serious disease.
And I would expect that will lead the R&D budgets to be focused on things we didn't have today. You know, we didn't have vaccines that block transmission. We got vaccines that help you with your health, but they only slightly reduce the transmissions. We need a new way of doing the vaccines. We didn't get much in the way of therapeutics.
America is a nation that can be defined in a single word. I was going to put
You're an expert. You were on the task force. You were part of this effort when you were in the previous administration. And you're saying in this administration that you can't rule out the fact that our government was lying to us when they told us the vaccinated could not get the virus.
I don't know about their discussions that they had in the task force. So I can't tell you that. I can tell you as a family member who had individuals that were susceptible, of course we got everybody vaccinated. But we still use layered protection during surges, because I knew potentially the vaccine immunity would wane like natural immunity waned. And there was evidence that every 4 months, reinfection was occurring in South Africa.
Wow. When the government told us that the vaccinated couldn't transmit it, was that a lie or was that a guess? Or is it the same answer?
I think it was hope that the vaccine would work in that way. And that's why I think scientists and public health leaders always have to be at the table, being very clear what we know and what we don't know.
This is important for the country to know. So when I asked the question, when the government told us that the vaccinated couldn't get it, and I asked you if it was a guess or a lie, you said you don't know. You said you think it was hope. So what we do know is it wasn't the truth. So they were either guessing, lying, or hoping, and communicating that information to the citizens of this country.
I think they were hoping, but you should know in those original phase 3 trials that were done in this country that we only measured for symptomatic disease. So we weren't proactively testing everybody in those trials to see if they got infected with mild or asymptomatic disease. And so people had to present within the clinical trials. We never had the data that it was going to protect against asymptomatic infection.
I'm just struck with the irony. We got government agencies guessing, hoping, or lying with the information they're presenting to the American people, and this is the same administration that wants to set up the disinformation governance board and wants to talk about misinformation, and they're the biggest purveyors of misinformation, false information, hopeful information, but not accurate and true information, which is again the frustration I think so many of the folks I get the privilege of representing have shared with me.
So you basically said this is going to be like, well, it's almost like, you probably don't see it like this, the two different classes of people. If you're vaccinated or if you're unvaccinated, you have all these rights. If you are vaccinated...
That is what it is, so, yep.
It means that instead of the vaccine being able, instead of the virus being able to hop from person to person to person to person, spreading and spreading, sickening some of them, but not all of them, and the ones that it doesn't sicken don't know they have it, and then they give it to even more people because they didn't recognize they were... Right? Instead of the virus being able to hop from person to person to person, potentially mutating and becoming more virulent and drug resistant along the way, now we know that the vaccines work well enough that the virus stops with every vaccinated person. A vaccinated person gets exposed to the virus does not infect them. The virus cannot then use that person to go anywhere else. It cannot use a vaccinated person as a host to go get more people. That means the vaccines will get us to the end of this if we just go fast enough.
You deserve a government that's going to continue to say, get vaccinated. And you know what? If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your choice. But don't think you can get on a plane or a train besides vaccinated people and put them at risk.
But don't think you can get on a plane or a train besides vaccinated people and put them at risk.
Saying they are backed up by a peer-reviewed report in the BMJ, leading medical journal. I mean, how worried should we really be? It's quite easy to paint a picture of nefarious goings-on, of big pharma as a huge shadowy industry who doesn't care about our health, only about their profit margins. I mean, is it really that bad, or is this a case of looking at something which could become potentially quite serious in certain areas if it isn't sorted out now?
I think it's very bad, actually. And it comes back to really the legal obligation of the drug industry. People need to understand is to produce profit for shareholders. They have no legal obligation to give you the best treatment. But the real scandal, and this was pointed out by cardiologist Peter Wilmses in the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine in a talk he gave in 2015, the real scandal is that doctors, institutions, medical journals collude with industry for financial gain, and the regulators fail to prevent misconduct by industry. And we have a wealth of evidence of fraud that's been committed by the pharmaceutical industry over the years, but for them it's the cost of business, because even though they've committed fraud, and we're talking about most of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies, and don't have to name any particular one over the years, even though they've committed fraud, in almost all of those cases, nobody got fired, no one lost their job. They were indemnified, if you like, from actually any kind of legal action against people within the company, even when they were deliberately, knowingly committing fraud. And then, even though they've been fined for those, malpractice, if you like, or deceiving the public or regulators, they actually end up making more money from profit of the drugs than they do from the criminal investigations and the harm that's, So the system, it's basically a symptom of our system failure. And then, why are we even talking about this? Well, what's happening to population health? You said earlier that, a lot of hospital admissions in the elderly are because of dangerous drug interactions, about a quarter, actually. One estimate suggests that the third most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer is prescribed medications. In the UK, we've had a stalling life expectancy since 2010. And now in the last few years, we've seen that in many parts of the country, healthy life expectancy has reduced. And at the root of this problem, of course, we've talked about obesity and lifestyle, but what's the twin evil, if you like, that's affecting population health in a negative way is essentially too much unchecked power of industries whose only motivation is profit, not to look after your health.
Papa. Hey, Papa.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
But what exactly do we mean by up-to-date vaccination? Let me be very clear. Up-to-date means you've received your last dose in the past 9 months.
If you've been following public health guidelines and gotten all of your recommended COVID-19 shots, you still may not be considered up to date on your vaccinations. That's because Public Health and Health Canada now say you need to have had your most recent shot within the last 9 months to be considered up to date.
Up to date is the right way to think about vaccination now. Now, fully vaccinated makes no sense now, so it's about up to date. So am I up to date in my vaccination? Have I received a vaccine in the last 9 months?
Health Canada and Public Health say the 9-month period is a combination of two things. First, NACI's recommendation that people get their third dose 6 months after the second, and a recommendation that people wait 3 months after becoming infected with COVID before getting a booster.
I think what Mr. Duclos was trying to clarify was that if there was a definition of up to date for administrative purposes, having that 6 months plus giving people room for, if they had an infection, to have waited that 3 month time frame, that is how that 9 months was arrived at.
We are finding ourselves in a place where we have increasing polarization everywhere, and everything feels binary when it doesn't need to be. So I think we're going to have to think about a recalibration of a whole range of human rights that are playing out online, you know, from freedom of speech to the freedom to, you know, to be free from online violence, or the right of data protection to the right to child dignity.
Sure, and I just first want to clarify that I was opposed to the CDC back in May when they lifted the indoor mask requirement. I thought that the honor code was never going to work, that when vaccinated and unvaccinated people are mixing, unless there is proof of vaccination, everybody should still be wearing masks. And so I actually support what the CDC is now doing, which is going back to this indoor mask requirement, because frankly, we know that we can't trust the unvaccinated, that they have been walking around without masks. And in fact, that's what led to the surge that we're seeing.
I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people are not going to agree with this, but don't get the vaccine, you can't go to the supermarket. Don't have the vaccine, you can't go to the ball game. Don't have the vaccine, can't go to work. You don't have the vaccine, can't come here. No shirt, no shoes, no service. That's where I think we should be right now, because we continue to waste our breath on people who are just not going to change. They're, you know, the circular logic. They just keep going back and saying, well, it's my freedom, it's whatever. I'm free. Well, your kid's not free to give other kids meningitis in schools. You got to take a vaccine to do that. You got to take vaccines in order to be employed. So what is the big deal? And all these people were saying, I don't want to put this stuff in my body. They're out drinking on the weekend and putting other substances in their bodies. That's way worse for them than a vaccine. So come on, let's be real.
Yeah, look, there are people who have health exceptions. I think they're the very pronounced minority.
The very important message that Dr. Chant and I are here to say today, and she'll give more detail, is if you haven't had your full doses, and most of the population know that you can have up to 3 doses, and then possibly 4 or even more if you're older and in certain circumstances with comorbidities, in other words, other serious illnesses, or perhaps you're immunocompromised. But if you've had 2, for example, or 1, and you haven't had your full 3, putting it bluntly, you're crazy. You should go and get them, because that is what's going to make a difference to stopping, or at least reducing, the chances of you ending up in hospital or ending up possibly dying. I can't stress this enough. I think there are some in the community who are just very busy. There are others in the community who think the pandemic's over. On both of those counts, they're wrong. So I would strongly encourage, I know I have friends who've said to me that they're fully dosed, and when I asked the question, they've had 2 doses of vaccine. And as the health minister, I quickly tell them, go and get your 3rd dose. I would encourage everybody to be a mate to their mates in New South Wales, indeed across Australia. Ask, have you had your full 3 doses?
Look, I think the evidence is really clear, and I think we have to acknowledge when evidence changes. So my message to everyone is disregard anything we said about 2 doses. It's 3 doses or more. And as ATAGI continues to watch the evidence, they might broaden the criterion. It's important that you keep engaged with those messages and know if you're eligible for further vaccines.
Professor David Livermore, wear it properly in crowded places. What's wrong with that?
I would agree if it worked, but quite simply, it doesn't. Trials were done pre-COVID, mostly in the context of influenza. I think 15 trials showed no effect. 2 trials in the context of COVID, Denmark being the classic of the 2, no effect. Country after country facing rising tides of COVID infections introduced masks. Didn't work. Basically, these are inconveniencing people for no benefit whatsoever. The virus is endemic. Everything we have tried to do against it is essentially failed. We just have to accept, as with the so-called Russian flu of the 1890s, which may well have been a coronavirus, it just has to bed in. We are the soil, it's the plant, it just has to bed in. Sure, maybe a mask delays you getting it by a week at most.
In terms of wearing a mask, our advice is clear that wearing a mask if you don't have an infection really reduces the risk almost none, not at all. So we do not advise that.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. And often, there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
People tend to leave them on. They contaminate the face mask and then wipe it over something. So it's really not a good idea and doesn't help.
There is no evidence that general wearing of face masks by the public who are well affects the spread of the disease in our society.
The evidence on face masks has always been quite variable, quite weak, quite difficult to know exactly, and there's no real trials on it.
And the evidence around the use of masks by the general public, especially outdoors, is extremely weak.
The recommendation from SAGE is completely clear, which is that there is weak evidence of a small effect in which a face mask can prevent a source of infection going from somebody who is infected to the people around them.
There was a statement by the World Health Organization, which was definitely against the wearing of muzzles. A few weeks ago, the World Health Organization did a reverse ferret and changed its mind. And Deborah Cohen of the medical correspondent Newsnight on the BBC had an amazing scoop the other day. She actually discovered, and she put it to the WHO, that her contacts inside the World Health Organization had told her that the position of the WHO on muzzles had been changed because of political pressure, not because of medical reasons.
Newsnight understands that the World Health Organization committee that reviewed the evidence for the use of face coverings in public didn't back them. But after political lobbying, the WHO now recommends them.
As of Monday, the 15th of June, face coverings will become mandatory on public transport.
We've therefore come to the decision that face coverings should be mandatory in shops and supermarkets.
Many Americans are under-vaccinated, meaning they are not up to date on their COVID-19 vaccines. Not all people over the age of 50 have received their first booster dose. Of those who've received their first booster dose, only 28% of those over 50 have received a second booster dose. And of those over the age of 65, only 34% have received their second booster dose. So my message right now is very simple. It's essential that these Americans, as Dr. Shah said, get their second booster shot right away. I do want to ask you about Jeremy Hunt, actually, because I feel very nervous about the prospect of him at number 10 Downing Street. And that is because of his response to the COVID-19 pandemic, primarily. And the fact that he was backing a authoritarian Chinese zero COVID policy. This is something that the mainstream media never talk about, but you have personal experience of that.
So yes, and interestingly, he's not denied what I've said about, because he can't.
He's refused to comment on it.
I've made sure that every conversation I had was documented. We knew inquiry was going to come, and I remember two things actually about Jeremy Hunt. One was meeting him just after I'd been made a health minister, just before COVID hit our shores. And I asked him what he was doing. Was he staying as an MP? And he said, oh yes, Boris can't deliver Brexit. Brexit can't happen. This government's going to fall on Brexit. I'm going to be here to make sure that I swoop in when that happens. So that was the first thing. The second thing was when COVID happened, Jeremy contacted me as a health minister and said, you've got to speak to Matt. It was at the time the Nightingale hospitals were being built. You've got to tell him that you
Matt Hancock.
Yeah, you don't put sick people in the hospitals. You follow a zero COVID policy. My wife's family have experience of this. When someone tests positive, you take them from their home and you take them to an isolation centre and you leave them there in the isolation centre. That's the only way you can beat COVID. And I said, Jeremy, the British public will not stand for mothers and fathers and families and children being removed from their family and their home and put in isolation. And he says, who said they won't? And I said, well, the Behaviour and Insights team, who I've discussed this with, they won't wear it. And he said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Show me the evidence for that, because I don't believe it. That's the way we have to deal with this, is a zero COVID policy. Now, we would still probably be in some sort of lockdown if Jeremy Hunt had been made Prime
We'll
Minister
look at China today.
instead of Boris Johnson.
Transmit the virus. So if you have a question and it's not clear to you, please consider speaking to your nurse practitioner, your healthcare provider, to get any further clarity.
60% is better than nothing, so why not just recommend it to everybody instead of saying it's a personal decision?
Because at present we're doing a risk-based approach.
What's the risk?
The risk, there's always a risk to having any therapeutic versus a benefit. You want to make sure there's a very strong benefit versus the risk. If for an 18-year-old healthy individual, the risk to getting hospitalized if we have no underlying medical illness is very, very low. We know there is a risk, a very small risk, 1 in 5,000, that may get myocarditis, for example, and you'd have to have that discussion on the risk-benefit of a complication from the vaccine versus a benefit of decreased hospitalization for a young, healthy person.
Did you agree with this decision then to open it up widely to all adults?
Pardon me?
Did you agree with this decision?
Yes, with the nuances of the language that I'm trying to get across of should get vaccinated if you've got an underlying illness, may get vaccinated under personal circumstances, but with the caveat as well, I don't want anyone thinking this will block their ability to get the bivalent in the fall. It should not.
So just to clarify, the myocarditis risk, my understanding was that it fell rapidly for second and third doses. Is that something that people should still be worrying about in third and fourth doses?
You're right. It can drop off, but for a young, healthy male individual, it's still a concern. It may be less than 1 in 5,000, but we'd have to still do that discussion with an individual.
History is truly at a turning point. We do not yet know the full extent and the systemic and structural changes which will happen. However, we do know that global energy systems, food systems and supply chains will be deeply affected.
Dear passengers, people who travel without tickets or behave disorderly or smoke in public areas will be punished according to regulations, and the behavior will be recorded in the individual credit information system. To avoid any negative record of personal credit, please follow the relevant regulations and help with the orders on the train and at the station.
Could have a 370% increased chance of being infected. In other words, Pfizer reported a range of vaccine efficacy so wide that no conclusion could be inferred. No reputable medical journal would accept such sloppy and incomplete results with such a small sample size. Yet, as you point out, without that clinical data, they're still pushing vaccines for infants and toddlers, for people who already had COVID, and boosters for young children.
That's right, and parents are not falling for it. After nearly a month of the government heavily pushing vaccines in kids under 5, only 3% of parents have chosen to get their kids under 5 vaccinated. More parents believe in UFOs, I think. Dr. John Walensky said over and over ago, we know people are eager to get their kids vaccinated. No, not the case. Why? Because the vaccine trial in kids under 5 failed. Vaccines in babies and toddlers, that study was done, and it showed no benefit. Now, why are we even doing clinical trials if when you get a negative result showing it has no benefit, they're approving it anyway? Yes. You're making a mockery of the process. This is what people within the agencies are very frustrated about. This is why they're leaving. Moderna's vaccine had a 4% efficacy. And Pfizer, the results were so bad with no statistical significance that one of the internal people within the CDC told me that you can inject a child with the vaccine or squirt it in their face and you'll get the same benefit.
Wow. So what you get is political science instead, and then you get skepticism from the public, and then in the future when you really do need the CDC or NIH deliver, you still have that skepticism. It's incredibly dangerous.
That's right. One person said it's like a horror movie they're being forced to watch and they can't close their eyes. If the CDC wants to win some respect back, apologize, show some humility. They made so many mistakes, closing schools, boosters in young people, masking toddlers, vaccines in babies now. Show some humility and less absolutism. I believe the American people are a very forgiving people. That's certainly what I see in my
Absolutely
practice.
Right. Well, Dr. Marty Makary, I don't know where we'd be throughout this without the work that you've done. Thank you for continuing it, and hopefully we'll get some accountability there.
There is a clear message that is coming through. This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated. We are seeing.
I just got a monthly briefing from my COVID team, and here's the latest data that confirms that we're still in a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
This debate about privacy versus security is as old as civilization, you can say. But there is something new now. For the first time in history, it's possible to completely eliminate privacy. Mm-hmm. It was just never possible before, and it is possible now. Something fundamental has changed. Mm-hmm. I mean, dictators always dreamt about completely eliminating privacy, monitoring everybody all the time and knowing everything you do, and not just everything you do, but even everything you think and everything you feel. Whether it's a tyrant in ancient Greece or whether it's Stalin, they always dreamt about it. They could never do it because it was technically impossible. Now it's possible.
We cannot hide away from human population growth because, you know, it underlies so many of the other problems. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago.
The most up-to-date information daily. You can trust us as a source of that information. You can also trust the Director General of Health and the Ministry of Health. For that information, do feel free to visit at any time to clarify any rumour you may hear, covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth. We will provide information frequently. We will share everything we can, everything else you see, a grain of salt. And so I really ask people to focus
The
on
most
that.
egregious example of that appears to be this text which originated in Malaysia and has become a viral hoax in Australia and in New Zealand. How irresponsible is it the people that are sharing that news of a lockdown imminent in New Zealand?
Yeah, and look, that's the kind of thing that adds to the anxiety that people feel. So I continue to share the message. New Zealanders must prepare, but do not panic. Prepare. And when you see those messages, remember that unless you hear it from us, it is not the truth. And I really ask people, just visit covid19.govt.nz. It has all of the up-to-date information, and we will continue to provide everything you need to know.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians,
We don't do that now, though. We don't mess around in other people's elections, Jim.
Only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for being here. It's always great to see you.
The nose swab's journey seems pretty direct, going from here to here to here. But before it ends here, its journey may continue as part of a mapping of genomic sequences. It's being used by scientists all around the world to track the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 variants. Here's how it works. Remember that nose swab you took? If it was a PCR test, around 5 to 10% of them end up here, in laboratories set up to conduct genomic sequencing.
Yeah, so to be clear, I think one of the things we're talking about here is that there are now weapons under development and developed that are designed to target specific people. Right, that's what this is, where you can actually take someone's DNA, take their medical profile, and you can target a biological weapon that will kill that person or take them off the battlefield or make them inoperable. So you can't have a discussion about this without talking about privacy and commercial data and the protection of commercial data, because expectations of privacy have degraded over the last 20 years. Young folks actually have very little expectation of privacy. That's what the polling and the data show. And people will very rapidly spit into a cup and send it into 23andMe and get really interesting data about their background. And guess what? Their DNA is now owned by a private company and can be sold off with very little intellectual property protection or privacy protection. And we don't have legal and regulatory regimes to deal with that. So we have to have an open and public discussion, and this is going to have to be a political discussion about what does the protection of healthcare information, DNA information, and your data look like, because that data is actually going to be procured and collected by our adversaries for the development of these systems.
A number of studies, New York Times just did one about menstruating cycles and how that is affected by vaccines.
Yeah, well, the menstrual thing is something that seems to be quite transient and temporary. That's the point. That's one of the points. We need to study it more. We need to study it more. We need to study it more.
Professor Mickey, if I can start with you first. Do you think that this is going to be right? We've had so much hope on the vaccines, hopefully changing everything, bringing an end to the pandemic, bringing an end to these changes we've had in our lives. Do you think it won't be enough?
Vaccines are a really important part of the pandemic control, but it's only one part. Test, trace and isolate system, border controls are really essential. And the third thing is people's behaviour. That is the behaviour of social distancing, of when you're indoors, making sure there's good ventilation, or if there's not, wearing face masks, and hand and surface hygiene. We'll need to keep these going in the long term, and that will be good not only for COVID, but also to reduce other.
So when you say long term,
NHS is
sorry to
going
interrupt, Professor Mickey. When you say long term, what do you mean by that? How long? Very quickly.
I think forever, to some extent, because.
Why didn't you say that? Oh gosh, forever.
I recommended to the president that we shut the country down, and that was a very difficult decision.
I so appreciate what you're saying, Doctor, about the moving target. At the same time, there were authorities that made different decisions than the CDC's recommendations, for example, on school closures, and they did not see higher levels of child mortality when it comes to COVID. And meanwhile, the schools that did close down were now seeing just disastrous levels of learning loss among poor children, children of color, mental health crisis. I wonder if you would recommend locking down schools if you had to do it all over again.
Well, you know, again, it's first of all, I didn't recommend locking anything down. You're asking me questions. You're talking about the CDC is the public health agency that uses their epidemiologists and their science-based approach to make recommendations.
I want to get your take on a lot of people looking at the president now having this, and all these people who have been fully vaccinated and boosted and all of that, and they're getting it. The 20% or so of Americans who've not been vaccinated might look at that, doctor, and say, well, why bother? Why bother? What do you tell them?
Well, if you're across the South and you're in the middle of this wave, what's going to save you right now is Paxlovid. But once we get through this wave, during that lull, you should get vaccinated and boosted because we do believe it will protect you, particularly if you're over 70. I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines, and it made people then worry that it's not going to protect against severe disease and hospitalization. It will, but let's be very clear. 50% of the people who died from the Omicron surge were older, vaccinated.
If you are a whistleblower in the Department of Justice, the FBI, please come forward. If you want to restore integrity and credibility to your agencies, come forward and tell Congress so the American people understand the truth. I would also make that appeal to people working in our federal health agencies. Our response to COVID has been a miserable failure, largely because our health agency has not been transparent. I've written 43 oversight letters to the agencies. Where I've gotten responses, they're non-responsive responses. Generally, I don't even get answers. This lack of transparency must end. We must restore congressional oversight because the American people deserve the truth. You know, every one of these confirmed secretaries or agency heads come before Congress, they raise their hand, and they swear that they will comply with legitimate congressional oversight, and then they don't. This has to end. The American people deserve transparency, they deserve honesty, they deserve the truth.
But as part of that challenge, I challenged the College of Physician and Surgeon of Ontario's directive of April 30th of 2021, if all of you recall, maybe not. In that directive, the CPSO said that no doctor or surgeon shall criticize whatsoever any policy of any public health official with respect to COVID-19, and that they could be disciplined or have their license removed if they did. Of course, Dr. Turek and other doctors, that's all they're proceeding on is their free speech. And in that same decision that said we're not hearing it now, they said and smacked the college a good backhand by saying, and by the way, that policy that you want to challenge, Mr. Galati, we wouldn't have reviewed it under the charter anyway, because it's not law. It's not binding on doctors. It's merely the opinion of the CPSO. So in essence, they won their short-term application to not hear me on the bigger issues with respect to the CPSO, but they lost a big issue in that the court agreed with me that if it's a question of pure speech, the CPSO cannot discipline a doctor for free speech, only for the practice of medicine and incompetence in that practice of medicine.
So I take a vitamin every morning. What if I could take vitamin authentication?
What?
Vitamin authentication. Look, I have one right here. Well, here, I'll let you hold it. Would you like to hold it?
I'll hold it.
Okay. So this,
you guys see it?
This pill has a small chip inside of it with a switch. It also has what amounts to an inside-out potato battery. When you swallow it, the acids in your stomach serve as the electrolyte.
That's what they do.
And they power it up, and the switch goes on and off. And it creates an 18-bit ECG-like signal in your body, and essentially your entire body becomes your authentication token. Yes, this is true. Okay?
Okay, but...
Okay, so wait. So it's really true. So what this means is that becomes my first superpower. I really want this superpower. It means that my arms are like wires, my hands are like alligator clips. When I touch my phone, my computer, my door, my car, I'm authenticated in. First superpower. Like, I want that.
So we're not shipping that right away.
Yeah, no. We're not shipping that right away. But it sounds like...
This is FDA cleared?
So here's the thing. This is not science fiction. This pill was actually made by a company called Proteus, and they've developed it for medical applications. That pill has been CE stamped and cleared by the FDA. You can take 30 of those per day for the rest of your life.
And then what happens? Does your heart beat change? Does your...
We can just tell that you've taken the pill. A tattoo that could be used for authentication.
With all due respect, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups.
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful.
I feel like there's other stuff you're not telling me, though.
I'm sure there is.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities, Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about the trouble and treatment of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Yeah, I worry about blaming the vaccines for endovascular anything, because I think there's something about this spike protein, whether it's from the infection or from the vaccines, that is doing some endovascular damage of some type. But what do you say?
Right. Well, but Drew, okay, so if you get COVID, you have the spike protein in your body for a matter of days before your immune system wipes it out. You get a vaccine, your body is given the roadmap, start creating these spike proteins. You're right, the spike protein is what's doing it, but you have just injected in you a roadmap that says, start creating this toxic thing that's going to attack all of your organ systems and is going to attach itself to the endothelium of your vasculature. So yeah, and there's no off switch. We were told, as I said, it will be eliminated from your body within several days, when it turns out it can stay for months. So yeah, you now have mRNA saying, produce a spike protein, produce a spike protein, produce a spike protein. So it is the vaccines, because you are creating the toxic component, the spike protein, in addition to anything having to do with nanoparticles.
In terms of mandatory vaccines won't be mandatory. That's not the way we do things in Canada.
And more restrictions are on the way. Justin Trudeau is promising vaccine mandates for the federal public service and for travelers.
We're going to make sure in the coming weeks that anyone 12 or older who wants to get on a plane or a train be fully vaccinated.
We are announcing 2 strong new mandatory vaccine measures.
In terms of mandatory vaccines won't be mandatory. That's not the way we do things in Canada.
Federal public servants in the core public administration must be fully vaccinated by October 29th.
Vaccines won't be mandatory. That's not the way we do things in Canada.
Are you concerned with the continuation and expansion of Chinese gain-of-function research?
Well, I think I testified here that in December 2019, they were doing synthetic biology on a cloning vector of the Nipah virus, which is 60% lethal. We just experienced a 1% lethal virus. My estimates would be that could set us back a millennium. The Black Plague was a 20% lethal event, and it was 250 years for civilization to return.
People who are vaccinated will still get COVID-19. It just means that they won't get sick and they won't die.
We still support the one China policy. We go there to acknowledge the status quo is what our policy is. There was nothing disruptive about that. It was only about saying China is one of the freest societies in the world. Don't take it from me. That's from Freedom House.
Let's talk a little bit.
Democracy, courageous people, and it's just, I don't know why it is, except there's some commercial interests who would like to diminish the relationship.
The IRS, the CIA, the Federal Reserve, the Department of Homeland Security, Medicare. I know that you used to want to end the FBI. I'm not sure whether you still support that idea, sir. Perhaps you can tell us. But if you get rid of the CIA, let alone the FBI, how would President Paul have any idea, any intelligence of what our enemies, foreign and domestic, are up to?
Well, you might ask a better question. Before 9/11, we were spending $40 billion a year. And the FBI was producing numerous information about people being trained on airplanes to fly them but not land them. And they totally ignored them. So it's the inefficiency of the bureaucracy that is the problem. So increasing this with the Department of Homeland Security and spending more money doesn't solve the problem. Yes, we have every right in the world to know something about intelligence gathering, but we have to have intelligent people interpreting this information. But, you know, just going for increasing presidential powers, as been discussed, is rather disturbing to me. This whole idea that we're supposed to sacrifice liberty for security, we were advised against that. Don't we remember that when you sacrifice liberty for security, you lose both? That's what's happening in this country today. We have a national ID card on our doorsteps. It's being implemented right now. We have FISA courts. We have warrantless searches. We've lost habeas corpus. We've had secret prisons around the world, and we have torture going on. That's un-American, and we need to use the power of the presidency to get it back in order to take care of us and protect this country and our liberties.
Thank you, Congressman. Let's see.
Anyone who's been paying even the slightest amount of attention can see that many of the so-called experts have been wrong on virtually every point in the last 2 years, from lockdowns to the injections being safe and effective. Bureaucrats like to keep the fear alive to solidify their own importance and therefore their own funding. And if there's one word I never want to hear again, it's modelling. When was the last model that was proven in hindsight to be accurate? It's not just the COVID experience which bells the cat on the rise of big government. One only has to look at the intrusions by government into our lives in areas like the climate, the surveillance state and the rise of the quasi-state operatives, the apparatchiks of the big government ethos in universities, in schools, the woke corporate sector and its insidious ESG agenda. Politicians must stop simply enforcing the whims of bureaucrats and the so-called experts. We exist to serve you, the Australian people, not to control your lives. There's an old biblical teaching which states, "The greatest among you shall be your servant." This is the basis for the Western ethos of political leadership. In the entire history of mankind, there has never been a bureaucracy which is sincerely and genuinely concerned about people. Always question everything. Always look for ulterior motives. Why have they allowed Australians to be vilified? Why have they allowed Australians to be thrown out of jobs and discriminated against? Because they care so much about our safety? Or is it something else, something more sinister? Nobody should ever take the risk on the promise of being granted their freedom back. This is the stuff of tyrannical authoritarianism, and I hope Australian politics realises that Australians have had enough of having their lives run by people far removed from them. This is Australia, not the People's Republic of China. We should be governed by the lowest and least centralised level of authority as possible to preserve our basic freedoms, including freedom of movement, speech and choice. It's time we scaled back the power of these bureaucracies, and it's time that politicians who say they love this country to go out and prove it. It's time we drain the billabong.
We have a COVID bombshell tonight with figures revealing the true number of deaths is much lower than feared. Just 10% of WA lives claimed have been from the virus alone.
30 new beds in a modular ward at Rockingham Hospital at a time they're desperately needed.
This is designed to provide additional beds to alleviate pressure on the hospital system.
That pressure is at boiling point and COVID isn't helping.
Overcrowding is the overwhelmingly dominant theme in all our emergency departments.
But new figures obtained by WA Today show the virus hasn't been as deadly as once feared. In the state's first 6 months of Omicron, there were 192 deaths from 902,000 cases, only 18 of them caused by COVID alone. In 49 deaths, the virus led to fatal complications such as pneumonia. 31 were coupled with pre-existing conditions, and the majority were a combination of all three. Only half the government's death tally can be attributed to the virus.
It's very difficult to differentiate between with and for. If someone has a range of comorbidities and chronic conditions, it's very difficult to determine whether it's the actual cause of death.
Experts crediting our high level of vaccination.
I think if you look back to the case fatality rate back in the eastern states in Victoria and New South Wales before the vaccination rates, it was about 3%, and that would equate to about 150 deaths a day.
Also rare, the use of ventilators, a common sight early in the pandemic.
It is just a tipping point on top of multiple other chronic issues. It's rare that it's hitting people who have nothing else.
Louise Rennie, 9 News.
The person that was chair of this committee in the World Health Organization before her was an American. He was Obama's information czar, Sunstein, S-U-N-S-T-E-I-N. That's in there. Cass Sunstein, Obama's information czar. Now, the interesting thing is what these people believe in. They say with their own words, they tell us what they believe in. So he's written a paper in which he spoke about the need to challenge conspiracy theorists, and the government needs to do so. This is the paper. And in this paper, there's a very interesting word that he uses. One of the recommendations he makes, right there at the bottom of the page you're looking at now, is cognitive infiltration of the groups that produce conspiracy theories. Now, I believe, Del, that this is an incredibly sinister term. You can see in recommendations 1 and 2, he talks about banning conspiracy theories and the government taxing or other financial otherwise imposing some kind of punitive measure on those who disseminate such theories. So already they've got the banning and the taxing.
Let me read it. Let me read it for people because it was really quick. Let's read through just a couple of these points really quickly. So here's what he wrote. Government might itself engage in counter-speech, marshalling arguments to discredit conspiracy theories. Government might formally hire credible private parties to engage in counter-speech. Government might engage in informal communication with such parties, encouraging them to help. Each instrument has a distinctive set of potential effects or costs and benefits. And there at the bottom, our main policy idea is that government should engage in cognitive infiltration of the groups that produce conspiracy theories, which involves a mix of 3, 4, and 5. Let's read the top. What can government do about conspiracy theories? Among the things it can do, what should it do? We can readily imagine a series of possible responses. Government might ban conspiracy theorizing. Government might impose some kind of tax, financial or otherwise, on those who disseminate such theories. I mean, so... yeah, I mean, like just total control. This it's certainly not based on the Constitution and the dream of America.
It's called the Fauci effect, which is sort of like, trust me, I don't get excited about that. I mean, it's nice, but I mean, people go to medical school now. People are interested in science. Not because of me, because most people don't know me, who I am. My friends know me, my wife knows me, but people don't know me. It's what I symbolize. And what I symbolize in an era of the normalization of untruths and lies and all the things you're seeing going on in society from January 6th to everything else that goes on, people, the craving for consistency, for integrity, for truth, and for people caring about people.
So, despite 2, 3, 4 doses of the vaccine, it's not so good at preventing infection in the first place. So we are getting infected. That's why we've had tens of thousands of cases in this wave. So it's really critically important to get tested if you're symptomatic, to get a PCR test if you're in a really high-risk age group, but to rat test if you've got availability at home. And there are many rat tests that have been made available by the state government. So really no excuse not to use a rat test if you've got symptoms, because getting tested and turning up positive can get you on a care pathway. And if you're on a care pathway, you can be assessed for your risk and you can have recommendations around the oral therapies that might be available for you. They also make a significant difference, especially for those most at risk. If you are in a vulnerable or frail age group or with pre-existing illness, taking those oral therapies can make a big difference to keeping you out of hospital.
Surveillance, people could look back in 100 years and identify the coronavirus epidemic as the moment when a new regime of surveillance took over.
Then the second time I saw him was the March after that, so March 2017 in the White House. In both of those two meetings, he asked me if vaccines weren't a bad thing, because he was considering a commission to look into ill effects of vaccines, and somebody, his name is Robert Kennedy Jr., was advising him that vaccines were causing bad things. And I said, no, that's a dead end. That would be a bad thing. Don't do that.
Free fries when you get vaccinated? I got vaccinated. You're saying I could get this? These delicious fries? Wait a minute. But there's also a burger element to this? Let me check with Bill Neathart. Is it too early in the day to eat a burger? No. This can be breakfast? Okay. I want you to look at this and think about, again, some people love hamburgers, some don't. Really want to respect all ways of life. But if this is appealing to you, just think of this when you think of vaccination. Vaccination. I'm getting a very good feeling about vaccination right this moment.
But guess what? We got a lot to do. You gotta say hi to me. We go back a long way. She was 12, I was 30, but anyway. And by the way, you know, I sit on the stand and it get hot. I got hairy legs that turn turn blonde in the sun. And the kids used to come up and reach in the pool and rub my leg down so it was straight, and then watch the hair come back up again. They'd look at it. So I learned about roaches. I learned about kids jumping on my lap. And I've loved kids jumping on my lap.
You know, we partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. You know, we own the science, and we think that the world, you know, should know it, and the platforms themselves also do. But again, it's a huge challenge that I think all sectors of society need to be very active in.
Oui, on va s'en sortir de cette pandémie par la vaccination. Puis on en connaît tous des gens qui sont en train d'hésiter un petit peu. On va continuer d'essayer de les convaincre. Mais il y a aussi des gens qui sont farouchement opposés à la vaccination.
Qui sont extrémistes.
Qui croient pas dans la science, qui sont souvent misogynes, souvent racistes aussi. C'est un petit groupe, mais qui prend de la place. Et là, il faut faire un choix en tant que leader, en tant que pays. Est-ce qu'on tolère ces gens-là ou est-ce qu'on dit, ben voyons, la plupart des gens, presque 80% des Québécois ont fait ce qu'il fallait faire, se sont fait vacciner, on veut revenir aux choses qu'on aime faire. C'est pas ces gens-là qui vont nous bloquer maintenant.
Now that it was 463 days, you tell us, from the time that you requested this V-Safe data. V-Safe is a CDC program where you just kind of report how you're doing after you got the vaccine. 463 days to get it. Why did it take so long in your estimation, sir?
It's a very good question. Why did it take numerous legal demands, multiple appeals, 2 lawsuits, in fact, before the CDC finally handed over the V-Safe data, which is already de-identified data for the most part that they provided just 2 days ago, 144 million lines of code that they could have provided in a matter of minutes at any point? It's a great question. Maybe the answer is that now that we have that data and we've looked at that data, of the 10 million users within V-Safe, 7.7% of them had to seek medical care after vaccination. That is an incredibly high percentage, it appears to me.
Yeah, and if I can, sir, I just want to put this graphic up to kind of follow along with you. You're right, 7.7 required medical care. We're talking about emergency rooms, hospitalizations. There it is right there. And on top of that, not to go you one better, but this is your information, another 2.5 million, we're talking 25%, missed work or school or had bad reactions to the vaccine. What's the takeaway for you from this? Is it significant?
It is. It seems incredibly significant. A big reason that they pushed the COVID vaccine is they said, look, not everybody's going to get, seriously injured by COVID, but for many, it'll prevent them from having symptoms, being hospitalized, missing work. Well, now that we have the data, we could see that getting the vaccine caused 25% of people who got the shot within this data set of 10 million people to miss work, to have some serious event affecting their normal life functions.
Yeah, and you also
But I do leave it to folks like Marty.
Let me start off with 2 words. Made in America. Made in America.
I must tell you, I believe that Alberta Health Services is the source of a lot of the problems that we've had. They signed some kind of a partnership with the World Economic Forum right in the middle of the pandemic. We've got to address that. Why in the world do we have anything to do with the World Economic Forum? That's got to end.
We're not Canada or New Zealand or China, places where they think they can exterminate COVID by depriving the population of the most basic civil liberties. But we still do have, I'm afraid, much to questions to ask ourselves, and even much to be ashamed of. I'm particularly ashamed, and I put it on record, in hindsight, of my own vote to dismiss the care workers who didn't want to take the vaccine. And I very much hope that the 40,000 care workers who lost their jobs can be reinstated and indeed compensated. Now, a group of us, including, I think, the Minister, held out against compulsory vaccination of health workers when that was proposed by the government last winter, and that resistance, I think, turned the tide to a degree on government policy.
Thanks for coming out to Dr. Fauci's retirement party. Truth, whether it be scientific or political, can only be determined by disputation, by argumentation, by convincing others, by voluntary acceptance. But the greatest originator of misinformation is the U.S. government. The greatest disseminator of misinformation cannot be the arbiter of truth. Both left and right need to wake up and acknowledge that government should never be allowed to create any entity that even remotely resembles a ministry of truth. And no bureaucrat, are you listening, Dr. Fauci? No bureaucrat should be above the law. No bureaucrat should be allowed to deny information to Congress, and no bureaucrat should be allowed to lie to Congress. When I return to the Senate as chairman, I promise you this, the COVID cover-up will end. And I promise you this, I will subpoena every last scrap of paper from our friend, Dr. Fauci.
It was when the intelligence services were never seen, never heard. But now they're loudly proclaiming your country needs you to keep an eye on those you know and, if necessary, dob them in.
Recognising a potential warning sign and then alerting NZSAS or police could be the vital piece in the puzzle that ultimately saves lives.
To that end, they're publishing a guide called Know the Signs to help us all identify potential terrorists in our midst.
To a person who is really developing an us versus them worldview.
But in the past 6 months, a third group has emerged, those motivated by politics.
And so it could be the COVID measures that the government took, or it could be other policies that are interpreted as infringing on rights. And it's what I sometimes describe as a kind of hot mess of ideologies and beliefs fueled by conspiracy theories.
You briefed the press, did you not, when you were there?
Well, I had several jobs. One of my jobs was that of analyst. I also was an interrogator and indeed briefed the press when we, the CIA, wanted to circulate disinformation on a particular issue. Disinformation is not necessarily a lie. It may be a half-truth. And we would pick out a journalist. I would go do the briefing and hope that he would put the information in print. For instance, if we wanted to get across to the American public that the North Vietnamese were building up their force structure in South Vietnam, I would go to a journalist and advise him that in the past 6 months, X number of North Vietnamese forces had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail system through southern Laos. Now, there is no way a journalist can check that information. So either he goes with the information or he doesn't, and ordinarily or usually the journalist would go with it because it looked like some kind of exclusive. And I would say our percentage planning that kind of data was 70 to 80%. The correspondents we targeted were those who had terrific influence, the most respected journalists in Saigon, like Robert Chaplin of the New Yorker magazine, Kai's Beach of the Los Angeles Times from time to time, and also he worked for the Chicago Daily News. Bud Merrick of U.S. News and World Report, Malcolm Brown of the New York Times, even Maynard Parker of Newsweek magazine. We would go after these gentlemen. I would be directed to cultivate them, to spend time with them at the Caravel Hotel or the Continental Hotel, to socialize with them, and slowly but surely to try to gain their confidence by dolloping out valid information which was true. And then I would drop into a conversation the data that we wanted to get across which might not be true. One piece of data, for instance, that we managed to plant in the New Yorker magazine had to do with a supposed North Vietnamese effort in 1973 to develop airfields along the border of South Vietnam. The reason we wanted to plant this information was that we were trying to persuade the U.S. Congress that Saigon should continue to get a great deal of aid, and that the North Vietnamese were the chief violators of the ceasefire accord. That was printed in the New Yorker magazine under the byline of Robert Chaplin, as indeed was a great deal of such information which we tried to circulate. If I planted a piece of information with a reporter, I would ordinarily then try to create an environment in which he could not check the information. I would go to the British ambassador and brief him on the disinformation I had just given the reporter. So when the reporter wanted to cross-check what I'd told him with, say, the British ambassador, New Zealand ambassador, or what have you, he would get false confirmation, the same message coming back at him, and he'd say, aha, I've got proof that Frank Snepp told me the truth, when in fact what he'd gotten was simply an echo of what I'd given him in the first place via the British ambassador or other of our friendly diplomatic contacts. I am, as an ex-CIA agent, opposed to the disinformation activities in which I was involved. I admit that I was involved, and I think it served no useful purpose. Propagandizing the American public or Congress is not the CIA's job.
On the G20, you were there meeting some of the leaders as well. Professor Schwab, what do you make of the result? Finally, they put something as a statement, and it seems quite positive with all the voices included.
I think it's positive. It's already positive through the fact that everybody agreed about the statement, which we haven't had the last years. Now the base has been formed, but we have to go one step further. We have to have a strategic mood. We have to construct the world of tomorrow. It's a systemic transformation of the world. So we have to define how the world should look like, which we want to come out of this transformation period. I respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years. I think it's a role model for many countries, but I think also we should leave it to each country to make its own decision what system it wants to adopt. And I think we should be very careful in imposing systems. But the Chinese model is certainly a very attractive model for quite a number of countries.
This latest section of safety barrier stretches 4.5 miles south from Peterlee. It should make this section of the notorious A19 a safer road. Indeed, the Department of Transport insists the dual carriageway isn't outstandingly bad as far as road safety is concerned.
I will not accept that it's a highly dangerous road. The road, obviously, like other roads, gives cause for concern when accidents do occur.
But Mr. Davidson had barely finished speaking when this happened.
So as soon as that work is finished, the Central Reserve safety fencing will go ahead.
Yeah. Luckily, no one was hurt in the crash. It was just another example of how hazardous the A19 can be.
Isn't it true that you've also been an advisor to Pfizer?
Yes, sir. I have been an advisor to Pfizer, and I've been working very, very closely with Pfizer, particularly their COVID vaccines, and going over lots of reactions and adverse events. So yes, I am working and being paid by Pfizer for my assessment of vaccine safety.
You're part of the Data Safety Monitoring Board for the
That's
Pfizer
correct.
COVID vaccine. Is that what you meant when you
That
just said
is
that?
correct.
You're one of the only 5 members of that Data Safety Monitoring Board over the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, right?
Yes, sir, I am.
And that's supposed to be an independent Data Safety Monitoring Board, correct?
It is an independent data safety and monitoring board.
That's the board that all of us in America are hoping on and relying upon is going to independently make sure that safety is properly assessed as the clinical trial for that Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine is ongoing, correct?
That's true, and let me tell you that we have worked very hard to go over this and worked very, very hard to do that indeed as comprehensively as we possibly can.
And since it's supposed to be independent, it's critical that the members of that independent Data Safety Monitoring Board are in fact independent of the pharmaceutical company whose product is being evaluated, correct?
That's correct.
But isn't it true that directly before becoming a member of the independent Data Safety Monitoring Board of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, you were an advisor to Pfizer?
Pfizer pays me to evaluate the safety of their vaccines because I'm an expert. So I do get paid to do the work that I've been doing, but I've been doing the work conscientiously and comprehensively.
My question was, before you became a member of the independent Data Safety Monitoring Board for the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, isn't it true that you were separately, before you held that independent position, you were an advisor to Pfizer?
Yes, sir, but I think what you're presuming is that because I've been an advisor makes me on their dole or makes me going to say what they want me to say. That is not and has never been a part of my being. I say what I believe based on my expertise.
So you don't think that financial incentives can sway people's judgment at all?
It does not sway my judgment, sir.
Why bother having an independent Data Safety Monitoring Board? Why doesn't Pfizer just have some of its employees on it?
Because we are independent.
Meaning folks who were never advisors to Pfizer.
We are independent from Pfizer in this assessment.
Every child in Canada has definitely earned a place on the nice list. Their parents and caregivers too. It's been a tough season with lots of viruses making people sick.
Thankfully, Santa and I are feeling as healthy as ever. We are both up to date with our vaccinations, including COVID boosters and flu shots.
That's so good to hear.
I always tell Santa to make a list and check it twice. 1, stay up to date on your vaccinations. 2, wear a mask in crowded indoor places and make sure it fits nice and snug. 3, wash your hands to the tune of jingle bells, jingle all the way.
Great advice.
I want to ask you about the cost of living, which you raised. Inflation is hovering around 7%. You know, the Bank of Canada has raised interest rates multiple times. It's causing such hardship for people in this country. I want to play you a clip, if you don't mind. We've done multiple stories about the cost of living, and this one in particular surprised a lot of us.
So people are so desperate, they're coming here for food, but then they're asking you about assisted suicide?
Yes.
You're having people ask you
yes.
about assisted suicide?
Yes. When I say that this is an emergency in the community, people who are living at the bottom income percentile in our community are talking to us now about taking their own lives because it's too hard to be poor any longer.
His monologue, it had been up to I think 3 million views and nothing flat, quite incredible. And Neil, it was a great monologue, because it was a kind of an Occam's razor thing, that the most obvious explanation for why everything has been screwed is because our rulers want it to be so.
100%. That is the conclusion that I'm coming to. I think it's been too painful. People have, quite understandably, myself included, spent the longest time tying ourselves in knots, trying to make it make sense in terms of an understanding of a benevolent, benign authority that, whether it was Tory or Conservative or Liberal, had your best interests at heart. And it dawned on me at some point in the recent past that actually the easier explanation was to say, well, no, they no longer have our best interests at heart. And once those scales drop from your eyes, then so much of it becomes much more comprehensible, and you begin to see it for what it is, which is a wholesale push by the state to take total control of our lives, our money, our diet, and everything else.
Well, it is weird the way they're quite open about wanting us to lead poorer, meaner, ruder lives, just in terms of how we live, what we eat, where we go. They actually say, no, however good it was for you 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's going to be worse for your kids now.
I think that's indicative of what I think is a massive mistake that's being made by them, that I think they think it's all in place now, that the trap has all been assembled and we're in it. And I think they've gone off half-cocked. And I think they're wrong in that estimation. And I think in reality, I think a lot of their narrative is crumbling like, desiccating sand in a sandcastle on the beach, and it's about to fall apart completely, I think. So there's a terrible misconception, I think, on the part of those who think they have us in their clutches. But I think what we're looking at is there's always been unholy alliances between businesses and corporations and government, for each other's mutual back scratching. But I think we're seeing a particularly lethal iteration at the moment, because the added twist is that now governments are prepared to legislate to make the consumption of, or the submission to, the mission statements and the products of corporations. They're now making it almost mandatory. I mean, what a brilliant business plan, for example, for a pharmaceutical company, hypothetically, to come up with a new medical product, right, and then have a compliant government make it illegal to not take it. Ka-ching, ka-ching. And likewise, if you've got a corporation who, for its own reasons, wants to change the way we eat, that whole philosophy, wants to come up with plant-based or fake meat or highly processed product of one sort or another for which they hold the patent. If you've got a biddable government that will make it illegal to keep cattle, that will make it illegal to grow wheat and barley because they've taken the land away from the farmers, then again, the tills are going to ring loud, because people are left with no option. And something similar is happening with the climate crisis, in inverted commas, where it's now, there are building wind turbines, laying out fields of solar panels, switching people to electric cars, taking away gas boilers, replacing them with heat pumps. We're losing choice. We're even losing the right to refuse. Yes. It's becoming, the governments are legislating against us so that we can't even say, no, I actually prefer the old way, I'll stick with that, thank you very much. I'll keep some folding paper money in my pocket, and I'll have a gas boiler, thank you very much. But that option has been taken away. So as I say, I think we're now seeing an iteration of an old problem, which sees a perfect iteration of a business model that for governments and corporations working in concert.
The Constitution is the guarantor of our liberties, so it should come as no surprise that those who crave power to rule over their fellow men always seek to suspend the Constitution by declaring and perpetuating emergencies. This is the trick that always seems to work. Declare an emergency and exempt yourself from the constitutional restraints on power that are necessary for the preservation of a free society. It is a strategy that has existed since antiquity. As our founders enshrined in the Constitution a system of checks and balances, so too did the founders of the Roman Republic. But when the crisis emerged, the Romans dissolved the restraints on power. That is how the Roman Republic died and how Caesar became dictator for life. There is a touch of Caesarism in the COVID national emergency. The president told us that the pandemic is over, yet the national emergency remains. When the Senate last voted to terminate the COVID national emergency in March, the White House issued a veto threat. At the time, the White House said, although we have made tremendous progress in combating the virus continues to pose a risk to the American people and our healthcare system. Caesar could not have said it better himself. The administration demands credit for how it wielded extraordinary powers, but it can never claim total success, for in doing so would rob the administration of the power it so craves. Have we forgotten what emergency powers look like? They look like lockdowns, where livelihoods and lives are destroyed. They look like a travel mask mandate. They look like robbing children of a full education. They look like the closure of places of worship. They look like a vaccine mandate for those working in large companies and the military. They look like an eviction moratorium in which the CDC claims the power to destroy contracts and effectively seize private property. When was the last time you heard the president tell the country it was time to relax emergency powers? His actions validate the argument made in Robert Higgs' classic work, Crisis and Leviathan. Higgs demonstrated that governments justify the exercise of extraordinary powers during an emergency, but when the crisis ends, even if government gives back some of the powers, it will never voluntarily relinquish all its newfound authorities. We are free from these monstrous policies only because the courts forced the president to abide by the Constitution. In restoring the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, the Supreme Court held that even in a pandemic, the Constitution cannot be put away and forgotten. It bears repeating. The Constitution doesn't go away. We don't dissolve the Constitution just because there's an infection out. The rights you were granted under the Constitution, the rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution, remain in place, even in a pandemic. When the Supreme Court ended Biden's eviction moratorium, it found that, and I quote, the CDC has imposed a nationwide moratorium on eviction in reliance on a decades-old statute that authorizes it to implement measures like fumigation and pest extermination. It strains credulity to believe that this statute grants the CDC the sweeping authority it asserts. The Supreme Court further concluded that our system does not permit agencies to act unlawfully. And when the court struck down the vaccine mandate, the court stated, this is no everyday exercise of federal power. It is a significant encroachment into the lives and health of vast numbers of employees. When the courts restored the people's liberty, you could count on the Biden administration to express disappointment and claim that disaster was just around the corner. But the administration, time and time again, was proven wrong. And now, even the president himself acknowledges what is plain to see for anyone willing to recognize what is in front of one's own face. We are learning to live with COVID. The one thing he does not seem to acknowledge is that the time for emergency measures has long since passed. A president should not be able to unilaterally aggrandize his powers by saying a magic word. If he will not terminate the national emergency himself, it falls to us, the people's representatives in Congress, to act. And in the wise words of one court, remind President Biden that there is no pandemic exception to the Constitution. Let us end this national emergency and restore the Constitution.
A significant percentage of the population has strong authoritarian tendencies, which can and will emerge under the right conditions. One of the darkest realizations I've personally had over the past year and a half is that I now totally understand how the horrific events of the 20th century came to pass. Now, to be clear, I'm not equating lockdowns, mandates, and other pandemic restrictions and infringements upon our civil liberties with the genocidal regimes of the Nazis or various communist parties. But we have all seen glimpses of the same psychology and tactics at play. It struck me how many dormant authoritarians we have walking amongst us, within our governments, even on our television screens. When given an ounce of power or control over other human beings, many people will take advantage of that and relish in it. We've truly seen this come to light. And it's something that we always have to remain vigilant of if we're going to establish and maintain a free society and protect our own individual liberties. Society is always one emergency away from tyranny. Resist the urge to force other people to conform to your beliefs and your behaviors, and also be bold in the presence of those who do. It's also vital to understand that propaganda is just as effective in the modern day as it was 100 years ago, perhaps more so. Access to limitless information has not made the average person any wiser. I'm old enough to remember when we thought the problem was a lack of access to information, and boy, were we wrong. With the rise of smartphones, tablets, and social media, it means that we are now more interconnected than ever. Every single day, we're bombarded with thousands upon thousands of messages, and brainwashing is still a very real thing. Now, nobody is totally immune to the effects of propaganda, but you can strengthen yourself against negative manipulation that plays on fear and division simply by being aware of its existence. Modern people are also very complacent and lack vigilance when it comes to defending our own freedoms from government overreach. I think over time, we've become far too comfortable, we've taken freedom for granted, and we've forgotten that every single generation has to fight for freedom again. Freedom is not the default position of humanity, it is the anomaly. With all that said, it's important you don't take your freedom for granted, no matter where you live. Understand that history is not something that's just in the past, it's something that is still occurring. Today, we live in tomorrow's history. And understand that everything that's happened in the past has the potential to happen again, simply in a different form.
Well, Senator, let me follow up by asking, do you think that the CIA and military intelligence agencies and the FBI have used the emergency provisions, both in law and by emergency agency, the Federal Preparedness Agency it's called now, to have contingency plans which threaten the liberty of American citizens?
Mr. Rowan, in due course, the committee will pass judgment on those questions. I'm not going to pre-guess the committee or prematurely attempt to pass judgment on this program. But let me tell you this. In the need to develop a capacity to know what potential enemies are doing, the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. These messages are between ships at sea, they could be between units, military units in the field. We have a very extensive capability of intercepting messages wherever they may be in the airwaves. Now, that is necessary and important to the United States as we look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know. At the same time, that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. And no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything. Telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. If this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny. And there would be no way to fight back, because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. Now, why is this investigation important? I'll tell you why. Because I don't want to see this country ever go across the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision so that we never cross over that abyss. That's the abyss from which there is no return.